Good evening. Welcome to Sony Irabor Live. Well, Nigeria celebrated its 65th independence anniversary just a few days ago on the 1st of October. Today is the 4th of October. But we are dealing with African affairs. That's all that concerns us in the studio today, because we had scheduled Dr. Nana Adom of Ghana, but based in the UK. So I'm going to, please, with your permission, let me read to you what this great man has. Dr. Nana Adom is a researcher, lecturer, recruitment strategist, currently with Anglia Ruskin University, UK, an alumnus of the University of Winchester and Anglia Ruskin University, Cambridge, a public speaker and writer with publications. He is a public affairs analyst and commentator with expertise in social development and human capital in sub-Saharan Africa, security and stability in West Africa, governance and leadership issues in Africa. That's my forte. I would like to think of it that way. He currently sits on the board of several organizations, institutions, and is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. So I'm very proud, if I say anything more, I'm very proud to have Dr. Nana Adom, and I will ask him how his name is pronounced. Dr. Nana, you're welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Uncle Sony. It's a pleasure. And I think growing up, even in Ghana, it was such an honor listening and watching you. So it's such a great honor to be hosted by yourself tonight. And I'm really grateful. Thank you. And by extension, let me also say thank you on behalf of Ghanaians. I think the service to humanity goes beyond the borders of Nigeria, even across in Ghana. We were watching you, and you were such a great inspiration to us. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I think one of your favorite quotes that I love so much is, look, if you worry, you die. Don't worry, you die, so why worry?
You got me there. You got me there. Yeah, that's really nice. Actually, looking at Africa and the rest of the world, I had to sit back at a stage to see, why are we blacks and the rest white or yellow or other colors? And apparently, the landmass of the continent is huge comparatively. So I was wondering, how did it get to the stage where we cannot speak for ourselves? Can we take it from there before we now look at what happened at the United Nations last week?
Thank you very much, Uncle Sony. I think it's a mixture. It's a variety of reasons, and I would first want to look at the historical context. I think we as Africans, we during the pre-colonial era, I think one of the indirect damages that was done to us is even the colonial times, they will export our raw materials. You know, the colonial masters will export our raw materials, process them into high value resources, and then sell it back to us. And I think over the years, that paradigm, that concept has not done us good. And we, over the years, even with independence, with Nigeria's independence, with Ghana's independence, with several African, Zimbabwe, several African countries' independence, we have indirectly not moved away from that paradigm, from that mindset. And that is one of the things that really has become a barrier for us, has become one of the challenges for us as Africans. And I think it's about time in this dispensation. It's about time we change the narrative and we change the paradigm shift.
Well, okay, good. You're consoling me, if I should say that, because I'm feeling, I feel kind of despondent because I feel as if we're being taken for granted by the so-called white people. They believe when you call them colonialists, you're a very noble man. Sometimes I get very carried away and get crude about some of these expressions. But then, when you listen to what happened at the United Nations last week, one is forced to see suddenly that Africa has suddenly woken up. Okay? Because it's as if they all did a research or did some homework and found out that they needed to now fight for Africa. But is that what we are going to experience? Or is it just a hoax?
Ms. Sonia, thank you very much. I think I look at Traore, Captain Traore of Burkina Faso, and I think Captain Traore's narrative enough of the narrative. We've had too much of it, and it's about time that we rise up. And if I'm going by Captain Narratives, let me quote him verbatim: "Africa must control its own resources," which is brilliant. And I think seeing him put that into action is really encouraging. And about time. Sorry. There's a bit of background noise.
We can hear you.
Sorry.
You're clear. You're very clear.
Okay. Yeah. And our time that Africa rises to really walk the narrative. I think, and like you said, seeing what we witnessed last week 2 weeks ago at the United Nations, from the various presidents, from the various speakers, really, really encouraging. And I think it's about time that from the leadership to the ordinary African, we rise to put this into work, not just do the talk. And I think it begins right with our leadership. I mean, hearing the various leaders say what they said last week was really encouraging, was really, so much worth, it inspired us, it inspired the continent. However, I think there's so much work that needs to be done because we've heard so much of this narrative previously. But however, the difference now is our leaders, beginning with the leadership, they need to really get us to put this into work. How do we do this? Like Traore, what President Traore, Captain Traore is doing, he's saying we can do with our own resources, no more borrowing, because over the years we borrow, countries, leaders have borrowed and we've not seen anything out of it. Because until borrowing is tied to transparent, measurable development outcomes, it's going to be the same narrative over and over. So how do we do that? Move away from wrongful borrowings, and make sure that any leakages from all these borrowings are cut off. Number two, changing the narrative, changing the paradigm from a resource-dependent Africa, to now a process-dependent, a process export in Africa. I think a number of African countries are very much dependent on just the basic resources, gold, bauxite, diamond, cocoa, name them. And over the years, that has been one of the reasons why a lot of African countries tend to borrow a lot, because when there are fluctuations or when there are decreases with world prices, then we begin to struggle. And the key is now to move away from resource dependent into becoming a process exporting economy like the Asian tigers. If you look at Singapore, Singapore has no natural resources, but it was able to move away from having no natural resources to now becoming one of the world's best exporter of IT-related gadgets and IT-related equipment. And for me, these are some of the practical ways that we can turn the narrative. So yes, Uncle Sonny, last week's UN message is it's time for Africa to rise, but I think the real work begins now.
You see, from what you said, Captain Traore has actually walked the talk by going further to stop borrowing. He not only stopped borrowing, he paid back everything his country was owing. And he's also decided to take the risk of, to the inventing and manufacturing electric vehicles. That's quite encouraging. But the thing is, I don't know how many African leaders, he's only 37, by the way. I don't know how many African leaders can take that bold, step forward. Nigeria is still borrowing, for example. I don't know about Ghana. Ghana was just one not too long ago, John Mahama. But the lady from Malawi, I think, the president of Malawi, she was also very feisty in the way she spoke. Now, can we see an African leader or some African leaders that will try to follow the direction of Traore, even though he's a captain in the army and came in by coup? So, there's the way the democratic countries talk about hunters and all of that. Do you see any other African leader towing or the line of Captain Traore?
Thank you so much, Uncle Sonny. I see Africa rising, and I'm beginning to see a number. I think in the next few years, I think we're going to see a number of these rising up. In particular, I foresee, I call it the fire from the north. And I think if you look at countries such as Burkina Faso, I think it was growing frustration with the imbalance over the years. We've got so much resources, yet very little to speak for. Like you mentioned, the lady from Botswana, the president from Botswana, Captain Traore. I'm seeing in the next 5 years at most, I am seeing. I reckon that we're going to see a lot more of the change and the shift in leadership within a number of African countries, because I think Africa is getting to a situation where it's getting to the place where the citizens and the continent feels that enough of the imbalance, about time that we take control of our own resources, like Traore said. So do I see a number? Yes, I see a number. In about 5 years, probably, if you are to ask me, I see a country like Zimbabwe. I foresee Zimbabwe rising. I foresee Tanzania. We saw it with a young opposition leader who unfortunately wasn't able to win. But I see that Kenya is also another example. I mean, recently, over the past few years, we've seen a wave of protest from the young ones. Look, ignoring the excesses, I think the youth wanted to clearly communicate a message. And I think the message has well been received by the current president, President Ruto. I'm also seeing a wave within the East African region as well. And then if you come down to South, I talk about Zimbabwe. I see a wave. I see such imbalance, frustration being translated into positive leadership, into positive accountability from the youth, not just from the youth, but I think the populace are saying about time that Africa rise, about time that we translate the abundance of resources, the abundance of scale, the abundance of wealth into positive and positive and equal measure of living for the population. So yeah, I would say in the next 5 years, I foresee a shift, a significant shift within a number of these countries that I do mention.
Okay. Now, I had a lady from Kenya on this show. At the same time, I had another South African lady, you know, and there was an interesting banter because at a point I almost lost control of the program because there was an argument regarding how some Africans react to some other Africans. And the serious question was the issue of xenophobia in South Africa against Zimbabweans and Nigerians. You know, they were singled out. And so the argument was based on the fact that the Kenyan lady said, look, xenophobia is not acceptable. The South African lady also said it's not acceptable. However, but South Africa is tired of people just coming into South Africa without documentation. Now, that is a major issue. How do you see an Africa that is united and there's no problem with, you know, documentation? Neither is there a problem with a country now saying, okay, because I'm Nigerian, if you are a Ghanaian, you're coming to Nigeria, you must follow the due process and all of that. Do you see that happening? Julius Malema was here and he gave a talk that he wanted a one borderless Africa.
Africa.
Do you see that happening?
Yeah. I see, thank you, Uncle Sonny. I see that happening. And this leads me on to the broader topic of racism. Let me touch on briefly on racism. And I think the issue of xenophobia, to a large extent, racism is rooted in history, systems, psychology, and even power. And thankfully, by the grace of God, I am well traveled within the African continent. And I'm even myself as an African, West African, to be precise, from Ghana to be precise, I get a bit surprised when I go to certain African countries and how I am treated, how I feel they look down upon me, or to a larger extent, the level of xenophobia that I have experienced in certain African countries. And this is me being a fellow African. And I think this has been passed on to an extent, like I said, through history, through systems, through psychology, and through power. And like Kwame Nkrumah said, late Kwame Nkrumah said, and Julius Nyerere, they said that, the realization of Africa, the realization of Africa's might and power cannot be achieved until we are united front. And credit to the African Union, credit to ECOWAS, credit to CEDEAO, and all the other regional blocks that are doing fantastic. They're putting in great ideas and all of that, trying to break the barriers. But I think to a large extent, there also has to be an education, because racism is nobody. We as racism, we need to unlearn. We need to unlearn xenophobia, because racism is taught, racism is modeled, and racism is absorbed. Likewise, if it's taught and it's absorbed, then it can be unlearned. And I think, in addition to what the fantastic blogs, ECOWAS, CEDAW, and all the other regional blogs are doing, I think we need to make a conscious effort as a people, as Nigerians, as Ghanaians, as Burkina Faso, as Togolese, as Kenyans. There has to be a conscious effort, right from our infancy, right from our primary schools to the secondary schools, in really teaching and saying to us that we are one, and that we will not be able to achieve our collective African goal and our collective African vision until we are united as one people. One of the amazing things that I love about the Chinese, and I think is a lesson that we can we can learn from them, is look at how big China is. Very huge, very huge across different regions, different time zones. But the Chinese are very united, despite their time zones, despite their different accents. They are very, very united. In fact, to a large extent, the Chinese will say to you that, number one, everything Chinese is the best before anything else. You look at the Japanese. My first encounter with the Japanese, they are going to a shop, Marks and Spencer, and they bought a shirt because they needed one for the occasion. We're going for a graduation service, a graduation ceremony. Right after we finished graduation ceremony, my Japanese friend took off the shirt and then put it in a bin and asked him. He said, "Oh no, I don't need any more. There are better ones in Japan." Because to him, anything Japan is first and foremost the best. And if you look at the unity that exists amongst even the Japanese, across different time zones, like I said, as well the Japanese, you notice that it's very difficult to break them. It's very difficult to speak a different language other than what they all speak as Chinese. And I think for us, there has to be a collective and a deliberate, intentional, because as I said, xenophobia, to a large extent racism, is learned, and it must be unlearned, and it must be unlearned right at the junior stages. So the generation today, the generation we have now, the young ones who are born now, across the various African countries, we need to teach them, we need to embed in them that we are one. So if we can get that right in their infancy, at their young stages, the next 10 years, the next 15 years, we're going to achieve the global ambition of a united Africa. Because they are the future, they are the tomorrow. And I think that will also complement the great work of the various regional blocks that we have within the African continent. So the future looks good, but a bit of work needs to be done by unlearning xenophobia. And it's not just South Africa, Uncle Sonia, as you said. You travel into other African countries, and it's even worse because those are not talked about, those are not being projected by the media. But it's about time that as a group of people, we begin to unlearn xenophobia, begin to unlearn racism right at the onset, right at the infancy stage, and encourage the young generation by saying we are one. Because if the young generation can start speaking the same language, then I think the future, another 5-10 years, the future looks really good.
We'll be right back. We'll take a short break now. And when we get back, we'll be dealing with the issue of how to unlearn xenophobia and then what the youths are up for or against Africa. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Well, the issue of xenophobia, we'll look at the youths of Africa. I've been told quite a few times that Africa is so loaded and so gifted, not just with natural resources. I think Africa is about the only continent in the world where the youths are so much more than the rest of the ages, So I have Dr. Nana Adom. How do you pronounce your last name? Adom? I can't hear you.
Adom.
Adom, okay, right.
Adom. Yeah.
Yes. Now, let's look at youth of Africa. Can Africa unlearn xenophobia or such heinous practice? And from there, we move on to how the youths are seeing African leadership.
Now, thank you so much, Uncle Sonny. I think, yes, Africa can unlearn xenophobia. One of our greatest challenges is the lack of education, number one. So how can we unlearn xenophobia? Is to educate, improve education, even at the infantry young stages. I think at present, very few African countries, very few African blocks, regional blocks, do teach on Africa unity. You know, even in our schools, in our primary schools, in our secondary schools. In Ghana, there wasn't so much emphasis on African unity up until, you know, when I was in secondary school, when I was in primary school in Ghana, there wasn't so much, there was so much they taught us about Ghana, but not on Africa unity. And I think potentially we should be looking at even potentially having a session or having sessions on Africa unity, as it could be, you know, it could be one of the models that even we undertake in our secondary schools. Because if we really serious on pushing African unity, then we need to push on the education, which as I mentioned, lack of education is one of the biggest barriers, given that the youth are our tomorrow, they are our future. So if we can start on learning this via education at the primary level, at the secondary level, and even at the university level, then I think we will be going somewhere and we'll be fulfilling the dream and the vision of a united Africa and eliminating xenophobia, which is one of our greatest risks as a people. The other thing too that we need to do is to eliminate silence and complacency. You know, the xenophobia, Uncle Sonny, in South Africa, the world got to know, we got to know because of the various demonstrations, because of the various speaking ups, because of the various media coverage. But I bet you, Uncle Sonny, and to our viewers, there are regions in Africa now that colleagues, there are regions in Libya, there are regions in Egypt, there are regions in Algeria, there are regions, you know, and just to name a few, that other Africans are experiencing significant levels of xenophobia. But there is very little, media coverage, or there's very little awareness about it. So there's so much silence, and the reason for the silence is because our colleagues are warned in fear that if you speak about this, you know, we'll come after you. If you do this, we'll come after you. So they are living in fear, and as a result, silence and complacency. And it's about time that the media, and as well, not just the media, but, you know, all of us as colleagues, as Africans, we need to voice out. We need to come out of the too much silence culture, where, especially in regions and in places that there is so much xenophobia, we need to voice out. You know, and by so doing, we'll be able to eliminate such cases of xenophobia and racism. The other thing too that we can do is, you notice xenophobia and racism evolves with time. You know, so as time progresses, you begin to, there are certain areas, there are certain units that one begins to experience them in different forms and shapes. You know, as the world goes into a digitalized world, so does xenophobia also, you know, go into that space. So we need to make sure that with time, as time evolves, we are being mindful of the new strategies and the new mediums with which xenophobia is being pushed into, and speak against such. And I think if we can do this, i.e. Deliberate intentional education and exposure, and we need the help of the media and the web, each being each other's keep and making sure we voice out, avoiding silence and complacency and speaking out, and making sure that number 3 as well, racism does not evolve with time, xenophobia does not evolve with time. So the various shapes and forms with which xenophobia is being evolved into, that we make sure that we don't allow it to happen, but rather put a stop to it. I think with these 3, if we can, to name a few, if we can look at practicing these 3 as a people, I'm sure xenophobia will be a thing of the past, and together we'll be one people in the next 5-10 years. We'll be speaking the same language he has seen. We'll be a united front, and together we'll be achieving the great potential of Mama Africa.
Okay. Now, as you were talking, a few things crossed my mind. Sure. One, of course, is leadership in Africa, age. Second one, the youth, whether emancipation according to Bob Marley, or whether survivalism, whatever it is. And the third, of course, has to do with the fact that there's this single-mindedness of the average youth because of the new devices they have. They're so individualized compared to what our time used to be, It's a bit worrisome when you look at the fact that young people are very techy, very technologically advanced in thoughts and words and action. Then it's also the fact that they complain so much that the current leaders of Africa are isolating them. And that's why they're always restive. I mean, you talked about Kenya earlier on with the youths and their restiveness or protest. It happened in Nigeria in 2020. It was called End SARS. And then in 2023, there was a resurgence of youth. The streets of everywhere in Nigeria was filled with youths insisting that they needed to be this and that. They called them all kinds of names. But my worry, to cut my long story short, is the fact that will the youth now be ready to take over? Are they really ready, or are they too busy with their individualism, with their devices, What do you think? It worries me.
Thank you, Uncle Sonny. I think one of the beautiful things about Africa, which you mentioned at the beginning of our session, is Africa has more youth, I believe, than most or any of the continents.
Yeah.
And we have a daring youth who are keen to explore opportunities. I mean, this is evident in the number of youth that are, keen to explore economic opportunities abroad, further education abroad, and several other reasons. Because there is, I think, to your average African youth, you don't teach them how to be ambitious. I think it's within our blood, but most African youth, the urge to achieve, the urge to be successful, the urge to see, transformation is within our genes, and it's something we don't struggle with. The average Nigerian youth does not struggle with with that urge, and I think the problem here, the missing link here, is the failure of leadership. So for me, Andosoni, it's not the lack of passion, the lack of youth that are willing to learn, the lack of youth that are ready, but rather is the lack of true leadership who would steer the youth into the right places and in making sure that them ambitions are guided and they are steered in the right direction. Very unfortunately, for far too long and in the past, we've we've been exposed to leadership traits that, hasn't been right, that has been loot and share, that has been, the way to prosperity is, for instance, through politics. And, to your average African youth that is ambitious, that is daring, I think receiving the right mentorship, receiving the right leadership is key. So are African youths ready to drive through change? 100%. Look at Uncle Sony. Look at the NSAS. Look at Kenya's recent upsurge with the youth. They genuinely want to see change. They genuinely want to, they're ambitious. These are young ones that want to see positive change within the economy. But rather, what they are seeing is a failure from our leaders. So, yes, they are ready to see and to drive through change. However, it will require a partnership. It will require receiving the positive leadership, receiving the right leadership, right mentorship, who will steer them, who will guide them, and who will make sure that their ambition, their drive is steered within the channel, within the right environment. So we are, but we are also hopeful that moving on and, again, reflecting on the various speeches that we witnessed at the United Nations the last 2 weeks, we are very hopeful. And we've seen some, Captain Tuari and a few others inspiring positive change. I mean, if you look at Burkina Faso now, the youth in Burkina Faso, I recently read there was a report I chanced on where the youth in Burkina Faso, suddenly the urge to travel is gone down, the urge to travel out of the country, because they are beginning to see under positive leadership, under the right leadership, they feel they can excel, they feel they can thrive, they feel the ambitions can be translated into positive results. So our youth, we are ready. It's a case of having a positive sitting under the right leadership to steer and to guide our youth into achieving something great for Mama Africa.
There's something you just said now that struck a chord in me, and that is the fact that there's Maxwell Chibumbura, or something his name, from Zambia, Zimbabwe or Zambia? Zimbabwe.
Yeah, Zimbabwe.
Yeah, he created or invented a car that doesn't require petrol. Okay, it uses air or water.
Yeah.
I mean, that could happen in Africa, in Zimbabwe. Now, the question is, will the other African countries want to patronize Zimbabwe or that young man so that those cars can be sold in Africa before anywhere else?
I think,
go on.
And also to add on, recently I watched a CNN documentary about a young man in Nigeria who pioneers or is leading on drone production. Right in Nigeria, so much so that he even supplies drones to Western countries. But the question that really caught my attention was, why is he supplying to Western countries? What about other African countries?
Exactly.
It's all good and brilliant, him supplying to America, him supplying to Western countries, Asian countries. But what about African countries? I felt very disappointed when I also read about the Zimbabwean when he was in the news, who had produced a car, a brilliant concept. And I was really hoping that other African countries would chant, on this bandwagon, support our own, push our own, place a number of orders. Unfortunately, we haven't seen that happening. In fact, I think what I rather saw within the media was I saw a lot of negativity coming from various African quarters about, how true is this? It being genuine? Did he produce it from scratch? And that was quite worrying, because I thought this is something, this is such an inspiring story that we see from one of our own. And instead of
Let me just stop you there. I've been told that we have a commercial break, so we'll be right back after the break, because this is a very interesting aspect of the discussion. Welcome back. Just we're about to round off. We still have a few more minutes, about 4 or 5 minutes more. Yes, but we really need to discuss what's going on in Africa. Why are African countries not patronizing such creative energies that you just discussed? A Nigerian with the drones supplying to the West, and then a Zimbabwean that did an electric car. I mean, why are African leaders not patronizing these very creative elements, maybe more on the continent of Africa? What do you think is wrong?
Recently, there was an African pioneer who died in Ghana. He is one of those who produced Kantanka car. He produced a number of things. He was such a genius. And I think one of the challenges that he faced right from the onset was stereotyping, right from our own. And I think, one of the challenges that we as Africans, we have is stereotyping, stereotyping from mixed lenses. Because I took the Zimbabwean who produced the car that runs on electricity, that runs on energy, 100% electricity. And the first question I heard was, is this possible? The first comment was, is it true? It's not true.
Negativity.
And it's so much deep-seated within us. And I think one of the solutions is to move away from stereotyping, even within us as Africans. I think as Africans, we really need to move away from stereotyping our own and believe in the potential, believe in the talent of us as Mama Africa. Because if we don't stop stereotyping ourselves, then the white man would have a better reason to even stereotype us. One of the brilliant statements I heard from a great scholar is, the world doesn't know Africa. It doesn't. It knows our stories that's told about Africa, but it's about time we told our own. And how do we tell our own? Is to move away from stereotyping and to project the Africa that Uncle Son, you and I know, the Africa that we believe in, the Africa that presents so much opportunities, the Africa that the world hasn't heard about. So for me is to move away from stereotyping. It's one of the things like colleague in Zimbabwe who produced this car. That would be one of the action points, one of the to-do things for us as Africans to move away from stereotyping. There's so much stereotyping within us.
What message do you have for African leaders based on what you heard at the United Nations, some of them, and then based on what you've seen? Because, I want to draw your attention to people like Dr. PLO Lumumba and Julius Malema of South Africa. PLO Lumumba is from Kenya. They've been very critical of African leadership. What do you have to say?
I think African leadership, Uncle Sony, has failed Africa to a large extent over the years, centuries. There's been serious challenges with leadership within Africa. Because look, Uncle Sony, have a look at it. As we say in Africa, if a fish stinks, it will start stinking from the head. And then it will spread to the other parts of the body. So however you look at it, leadership has a great responsibility, and over the years, as I mentioned, we've had several several challenges with leadership. I take the example of Singapore. You know, one man, a leader by name Lee Wang Kun.
Yeah.
One man rose up and said, you know what, we're going to change the narrative. Before Ghana had independence, Ghana and Nigeria had independence in the late 60s. We had independence way before Singapore. To think that Singapore's GDP was nowhere near that of Ghana and Nigeria in the 60s, and to look at the situation today, it all boils down to leadership. Because what Lee Wang Kun did for Singapore was to make sure he enacted he built Singapore on three major principles. Number one, meritocracy. Number two, pragmatism. Right? And number three, honesty, MPH. And I'm sure Uncle Sonny, you said it.
Yes,
and
I'm afraid.
That was the style of leader.
I'm afraid we have to end it here. Thank you so much.
Sure.
So, please, you have to give us some other time. I need to talk to you again about some of these unfolding things that are happening in Africa. Thank you so much, Dr. Nana Adom. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Uncle Sonny. Really grateful.
Right.
Thank you, our viewers tonight. Thank you all.
So, Nigeria turned 65 just a few days ago on the 1st of October. And the 4th of October, we're having Dr. Nana Adom talking about Africa. But Nigeria is a giant of Africa. And good night, everyone.